Hey y'all, it's Jennifer. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to another Victober video. Today, I thought I would talk about where I started with some of the biggest Victorian authors and whether or not I think you should do what I did and actually start there. So this has kind of been inspired by two recent videos that I have done for Victober where I was talking about Wilkie Collins and Charles Dickens, and I talked about the fact that I started with what I think are their most popular works and are actually, in my opinion, their best works, and thus everything after that I have compared to that original book that I read, and I felt like it was all downhill from there. So I kind of struggle to recommend starting with what I think is an author's best work. On the other hand, sometimes you just have a feeling about an author and you know that you're probably really just going to get around to reading one thing by them. And then, in my opinion, it's probably worth your while to read the most popular work that they have, or the best work that they have, so to speak. So I have, I think, tackled more than a few really popular Victorian authors in my day over the years, and I decided that maybe I would look back on where I started with them and see if that's actually what I would recommend to other people. When I first started getting back into classics, Victorian literature was what I tried because I never had the opportunity to really study Victorian literature in school. It was absolutely not a focus for me in high school. I think at the very end of high school, we had a project where we had to read one Victorian novel and write a paper on it, and I chose Wuthering Heights, which I tend to remember as the first Victorian book that I ever read, though I think I read The Picture of Dorian Gray much earlier in my life than that. But when I was in college and university, I was an English minor, but I was kind of an Elizabethan Renaissance English minor, and so I never touched anything in the Victorian period, weirdly enough. And so when I decided to get back into classics, I really wanted to try something that I had never been exposed to, that I had never had the opportunity to explore in school, and so I chose Victorian literature. And what I really did was I went down kind of the greatest hits list, or basically lists of these are the 100 books that you should read before you die. And so I know that I tended to start with most Victorian authors with their most popular work. Now, this is not always the case, but I think for the most part, when I was getting into Victorian literature, that's what I chose to do. And I don't necessarily know if in some cases it was the right thing to do. So let's get into my list. These are really who I consider to be truly the big Victorian authors, and I only decided to include authors that I have read more than one thing from, or that wrote more than one thing. So I did speak a little bit about Emily Bronte. You could start one of two places with her poetry or Wuthering Heights, and I think either of those is a really great way to go. The same could be said, I think, for Anne Bronte. You could kind of start with her poetry. You could start with The Tenant of Wildfell Hall or Agnes Grey. I didn't feel like there were enough options there, so I decided not to include people with only a handful of works or only one work. And I also basically decided to only talk about authors that I have read more than one thing from. So let's just get into my list. These are going to be in no particular order. For Elizabeth Gaskell, I started with North and South, and I imagine this is something that a lot of people did. So North and South was actually one of the first classics that I read to get me back in to reading classics. And I'm really glad that I chose North and South to do that because I think it was a really easily readable book. It was very fun to read, and it was just simple enough that I could get used to the language of the Victorian period when I hadn't been used to reading a classic in a long time. Now, North and South, I would say, is the most popular of Elizabeth Gaskell's works. Elizabeth Gaskell is really, really popular here on BookTube, but outside of BookTube, when I first started getting back into Victorian literature, I had heard of North and South, but I hadn't heard of anything else by her. I personally think that starting with North and South is a really good idea. I'm very glad that I did it. And I know that North and South, for a lot of Elizabeth Gaskell fans, ranks very near the top of her works. So this is one that I should probably feel a little bit more conflicted about, the same way that I did with Charles Dickens and Wilkie Collins. But I will say, I really love North and South. North and South is one of my favorite Victorian novels, but Mary Barton by Elizabeth Gaskell might be my favorite work of hers, and I read that long after North and South. I think this is a really great place to start because I just think you will know from this whether or not you like Elizabeth Gaskell's writing style, whether you're really gonna like how she deals with themes, if you're gonna like how she writes characters. I think North and South is a really wonderful place to start for all of those reasons. And it's also really strong on social commentary, which I think is something Elizabeth Gaskell does very, very well. So this is one that I completely agree with. I started with North and South, and I absolutely think that you should start there too. Now, there is a Bronte with more to her name than just a couple of works, and that is Charlotte Bronte. So I started, again, as I'm sure most people did, with Jane Eyre. And Jane Eyre was another that started me on my journey with Victorian literature. And I hated Jane Eyre so much the first time I read it. I gave it a very generous 2 stars. I just genuinely hated the book. And I think a lot of it, weirdly enough, came down to her writing style. But since this was one of the first Victorian novels I tried, I don't know that I was ready to read her writing yet. I think she can be a little bit denser than some other Victorian authors can be. And so I just don't know that I was really ready to read Jane Eyre when I did pick it up. I have since reread Jane Eyre and fallen completely in love with it, and it's a 5-star book, and it's one of my favorites of all time. Now, there are many other places that you could start with Charlotte Bronte. A lot of people like to read her chronologically, so a lot of people will read her like Juvenilia and then The Professor, which is a novel she wrote that was never published. People will read Shirley first, people will read Villette first. I mean, really anything goes. I still think Jane Eyre is probably your best bet. I have not truly loved anything else from Charlotte Bronte that I have read. In fact, I DNF'd Villette, and I don't know that I'll ever return to it. And so truly, Jane Eyre might be the only novel of hers that I really truly enjoy and that I can really tell you that I loved. So this is one I also agree with. I think that you should definitely start with Jane Eyre. And more objectively and less about what I prefer and less about what I like, I think Jane Eyre is a little bit more of a straightforward story than some of her other novels, and I think it's probably something you've been introduced to through pop culture, and which makes it a very interesting place to start not only with Charlotte Bronte, but with Victorian literature in general. So I think Jane Eyre is a great book to start with for her, and just in Victorian literature in general. I think it's a very linear story. It's told in first person, so it's really easy to follow, and it is a story that you likely know at least something about, even if you don't know the big beats. So we're kind of off to a good start here. I am completely agreeing with past Jenny most of the time. Okay, let's talk about my favorite Wilkie Collins. I started with The Woman in White, which is still my favorite book of Wilkie Collins's, and it is my favorite Victorian novel. Wilkie Collins was an incredibly prolific writer. He wrote tons, and The Woman in White is one of around 4 that you often hear the most about. And prior to BookTube, Wilkie Collins is not one that I had ever heard of. So this is one that I kind of stumbled across during my first Victober, and I read it and I fell in love, and I've never looked back. So this is a sensation novel, and it is very, very big. This is probably the first on this list that is truly one of the iconic Victorian tomes. This is a very long book. I don't think it feels that long when you're reading it. I think you get really invested in the story and the characters, and it doesn't feel as though you're reading something that's 750 pages long at all, in my opinion. But since I really love Wilkie Collins and I fell in love with him through this book, I have gone on to read quite a few of his novels, and none of them are as good as The Woman in White to me. And so in a weird way, I want to say don't start here because I think this is the best he has to offer. I think you could start with The Moonstone or maybe Armadale first, or even something shorter that's a little bit less popular. But I think you should save The Woman in White for later. I think you should save it as a treat. On the other hand, I just love this book so much that I really do want to recommend it. And it is where I started. And clearly it was good for me because I fell in love with Wilkie Collins. I discovered a new favorite author, and I decided that I really wanted to read quite a bit from him. The only problem is I do think this is the best book of his out there. And so everything else I've read by him, I've tried to measure up against this, and it does fall rather short for me. So this is one that I am very torn on. I think you could start here, but I also think it might be better if you started with something like The Moonstone. The Moonstone is also pretty long, but it's not as long as this one. And it's also, in a similar way, just as popular as this. But I just love this. I think this is a tighter story. And so, I don't know. I'm very torn on it. I do think The Moonstone or The Woman in White are really great places to start. And you may discover through this that you don't like a sensation novel, that you don't like the way Wilkie Collins writes. And then you will know at least that you've read the best that he has to offer, in my opinion. I have no regrets about starting here. I don't wish that I had read something else, because I do wonder, had I read one of his lesser known books, I probably would have liked it, but would I have fallen in love, and would I have said that I absolutely want to read everything that this author wrote? I don't know that I would have. So if I'm going with that train of thought, then absolutely start with The Woman in White. But if you do have a good sense about Wilkie Collins and you have a feeling that you're probably really going to like him, I think you could start elsewhere and save this for later as kind of a treat. Next up is a really iconic Victorian author that during this Victober I've come to have extremely mixed opinions on, and that is Thomas Hardy. So for Thomas Hardy, I started with Far From the Madding Crowd. I am so glad I did this. I highly recommend starting here. This is one of, I think, 2 Hardy novels that I can say I truly loved, because I have DNF'd others. Others were just fine, but I truly loved this. And I also loved Return of the Native, so I would recommend that as well. But I think Far From the Madding Crowd is a really great place to start. This was another that was one of the first Victorian novels that I tried reading, and I was just absolutely in love with it. I think Thomas Hardy has a very particular writing style that not everyone is going to like. Now, I tend to really like his writing, and I think it works very, very well in something like Far From the Madding Crowd. Thomas Hardy does have a bit of a reputation for being really sad, for his books taking a really dark turn, and this is one of his novels that isn't quite so dark and so sad. This is not Tess of the D'Urbervilles by any means, and I think that makes it a really good place to start. I think if you like Thomas Hardy happy, you're willing to give him a shot with his darker, sadder stories. This is a really romantic book as well, and it features some of my favorite characters in Victorian literature. But I think that kind of makes this, alongside something like Jane Eyre, not only a good place to start with this author, but a great place to start with Victorian literature in general if you have been skeptical about it, or if you think it's going to be very dense to read. I kind of started here, and I've never regretted it. In fact, it really made me fall in love with Thomas Hardy. It has been other books that I have picked up by Thomas Hardy that have made me struggle with him quite a bit, actually. But this is one that I do truly love, and I highly recommend. So absolutely, I would say start with Far From the Madding Crowd for Thomas Hardy. For Anthony Trollope, I started with The Warden, and I think this was actually rather unusual. For a lot of these, I think I started in the same place that most people did, with some of their most popular works. But for Anthony Trollope, I started with The Warden, which is the first in his Barsetshire Chronicles series. I think a lot of people start with Anthony Trollope in this series, but with a different book. So I think a lot of people actually start with Dr. Thorne, which is the 3rd book in the series. I've heard of people starting with Barchester Towers, which I think is the 2nd book in the series. A lot of people skip The Warden with the intent to come back to it because it is very, very short, and it has a reputation for being rather boring. So I will caveat this by saying I DNF'd this the first time that I tried reading it because I did find it so boring, but I came back to it a year later and I absolutely loved it. And I think it's very cozy and very whimsical feeling, weirdly enough. I don't think it's appropriate to read at this time of year. Now, I am kind of a seasonal reader. I know a lot of people are not, but I do tend to read books in seasons that feel appropriate to them. The Warden feels very spring, summer to me. It doesn't feel very autumn, but maybe there are other books in the Barsetshire Chronicles that do feel a bit more appropriate to this time of year. But this is very short. I think it gives you a really good taste of his writing. So this is one I also have to agree with. Alternatively, I would say for Anthony Trollope, you might want to read one of his standalones before you try reading one of his series. I know a lot of people feel like once they start a series, they feel like they're locked in and they have to finish it, even if they're not really enjoying it, so to speak. And to call this a series is very, very loose. I mean, the stories are interconnected, characters do pop up in different books, but it's not something that's dependent on you having read the last book in the series to understand what's going on in the current book. But I still think that maybe if you are somebody who feels like you have to finish a series once you've started it, you might want to start with one of his standalones rather than this. But I think The Warden is a pretty great place to start with Anthony Trollope. Okay, here's something controversial. So where I started with George Eliot was Middlemarch. And I am going to stick to my guns here. I actually think this was a very good idea. I think this was the best thing to do because I think for a lot of us, Middlemarch is a very intimidating read, largely because of its size. It looms pretty large in Victorian literature, and I think we're just kind of putting it off when we try to read other things before it, in my opinion. And I knew I would do that. If I started somewhere else with George Eliot, I thought I would leave Middlemarch to the last. And so I decided really to just dive right into Middlemarch in my first Victober. And I'm glad I did. I struggled with Middlemarch, but I won't say that that's unique to this book. I think I just struggle with George Eliot in general. I DNF'd several of her books, and this month I read Romola, which I really enjoyed, but I have to say I did really struggle with her writing. I think her writing is very, very dense for the Victorian period, and I don't think it's going to work for everyone. But I think Middlemarch is the most famous of her works, and it probably is so for a reason. I think of all of her works that I have tried, certainly against those that I've DNF'd, Middlemarch is definitely my favorite, and it is the book of hers I can see myself returning to. Now, overall, I just felt like this was okay. I didn't really come away from it wowed, and I expected to be. I expected to rate this 5 stars, but that's not necessarily what happened. I do have the sense that this would move up for me on a reread, and so maybe that's the case, but it is the book of hers I can see myself wanting to reread, whereas some of the others I have really, really struggled with. There are many, many places that you could start with George Eliot, and probably it would be more manageable than starting with Middlemarch, but I decided to take the plunge and dive in, and I'm really glad I did. It tackled one of the big ones on my TBR and got it off early. And then now I no longer feel intimidated by any Victorian novel of any length because I know that I've read Middlemarch. A lot of people really, really love George Eliot. And so you might be one of those. And if you are, and if you get the sense that you will be, definitely you could start in another place. I think you could start with Adam Bede. I would not start with Romola. I enjoyed Romola, but I enjoyed it largely because it was set in Renaissance Italy. That is like an added layer to her writing that I think could be kind of dense for people. So I really liked that, but I can see that it's hard for some people to enjoy, so that's not one I would suggest you start with. But Adam Bede, Daniel Deronda, I think you could start there. But if you were just really aching to take the plunge and really to get this one off of your kind of bookish bucket list, it's really doable. I read this when I was feeling a whole lot less confident about reading larger books. And I'm glad I did because I think this was one in a long step that kind of got me over my fear of books over 500 pages. This is really enjoyable, but it is also a slower book than some other Victorian tomes. There's not so much plot happening here to me. It's more character focused, and if you are a character focused reader, this book won't feel long to you at all. It didn't feel long to me. So this is one that I think could go either way. I think you can definitely start here. In fact, I would suggest it. But so many people love George Eliot, and I am sadly, I don't think one of those people. So many people love her that I think you could start somewhere else because you'll fall in love with her elsewhere, if that makes sense. For me personally, I was always going to be okay if Middlemarch was the only title of hers that I read. So I started with Middlemarch, and I think you could do it too. Last but not least, let's talk about Charles Dickens. So I started with Great Expectations. This is the one that kind of spiraled me down this deep dark hole that inspired this video. I think Great Expectations is one of my favorite books of all time, but I think it is also the best that I've seen from Charles Dickens. It has everything I love in a book in it. And there are other books of Charles Dickens's that are also really, really great, that also have a lot of components that I truly love. They just don't do it like this. This book is very gothic, it's very spooky, and it's just so perfectly done. Everything adds up in the end, everything ties together, and that happens quite a bit in Dickens's novels, but I think it's done to perfection here. This is the only one on this list that I will say I regret starting with. I wish I had read something else by Charles Dickens before this, because this set me up to really enjoy Dickens largely, but everything I've read since then has never measured up to this. The reason I am torn on it is that it was suggested to me as a really great place to start with Charles Dickens because it's not very long and it's also written in first person, so you're not juggling all of the 25 characters that you may have to do in other Dickens novels. And so when I think about that, it is still a very great place to start. This and David Copperfield both do that and do that very well. David Copperfield is longer. That's why I chose Great Expectations. But in many ways, I wish that I had chosen to read David Copperfield first. I think I would have enjoyed David Copperfield more. I think that would have left a really, really great treat for me later in my reading of Charles Dickens. And I also really enjoyed David Copperfield, so I still think I would have fallen in love with Dickens elsewhere. I think I would have fallen in love with him in A Tale of Two Cities, David Copperfield, The Pickwick Papers. I think I just like his writing, so I know he would have gotten me in another book if it hadn't been this one. So I wish I had saved this. But I still think it can be a great place to start, especially if you are newer to Victorian literature, because it is written in first person, and because the story is so much fun. It's a very linear story. There's not too many different side plots going on that you have to keep up with. So this is one that can go either way. I think you could do worse than starting here, but I still think you should save this for later. For my money, I would say start with David Copperfield. That may go against everything else that everybody else says, but I say start with David Copperfield. Even though it's long, it's so dreamy, and it's so good. It's also written in first person, so you're not juggling all of those characters, but it also is kind of grounded by really, really wonderful main characters as well as antagonists. So for my money, I say start with David Copperfield and save this for later. So that is where I started with a lot of really big Victorian authors. I would love to know down below where you started with these authors, where you started with other Victorian authors that I didn't include here, and whether or not you agree with your past self. Do you think that's where you should have started? Is that what you would recommend to other readers? But that's going to be all for me today. I hope you're all having a great week. Happy reading, happy Victober. Goodbye.